How a romance novel saved the galaxy by Ariana De Rente. Chapter 31. Nico Diaz. Ree didn't like taking jobs for the Hutts. They never paid that well, always asked you to do something you regretted later, and you inevitably were required to just stand there for hours in their presence watching their perverted pleasures. Unfortunately, both the plasma injectors in the engine on his ship had gone bad at nearly the same time, so Ree was stuck on Karukan until he could earn enough to get off the planet. Blusug the Hutt made most of his money in the spice and smuggling trade. Ree had been hired to provide visible security to his dealings, some of which had been suffering from unexplained losses these past few months. So far, Ree hadn't detected anything more egregious than some of the spice dealers sampling their own wares before they hit the street. There was another meeting tonight, this time in a building near the edge of the Montauk City Dome. It reminded Ree of his childhood growing up in Sundari, though Sundari's dome was not see-through like Montauk's. His boor, or mother, as she insisted on being called, had tried very hard to raise him as a new Mandalorian, but Ree had fled to find his other boor as soon as he was old enough to reach the controls of a speeder. The culture couldn't be more different on Kirkan compared to the staid facade of Sundari, considering he was watching spice being unloaded by the kilo in the middle of the day in a populated area. He supposed that Kirkan and Mandalore did share a history of their people destroying their planet's environment, however. He was idly debating whether or not it was better to have destroyed your planet via endless warfare versus rampant pollution when he heard a young voice cry out. Another Hutt was approaching from the other side of the building, the Hutt's lackeys dragging a whole train of Ade, chained together and miserable. Ree bared his teeth under his boucher. He had specifically chosen to work for Blusug because the Hutt didn't regularly deal in slaves. Of course, you never knew what new depravity a Hutt might throw at you. Blusug negotiated with the other Hutt before handing over a portion of the spice in return for the line of Ade. The Hutt obviously knew next to nothing about Mandalorians because he didn't blink his huge eyes when Ree volunteered to watch the Ade for his employer. He was handed the electronic unlock for their chains and told to take them to what was essentially a slave market on the other side of the city. If Ree had his way, they would never get there, but he'd have to be smart about this. He didn't know the local underground paths for smuggling out escaped slaves, and he couldn't take them on his own ship considering its non-working state. He considered what to do as he led them slowly out of the building. The youngest Ad looked barely 5 years old. Their legs too short to keep up with the older Ade. Ree needed first to get them out of the building and the surveillance of his now former Hutt employer. Then he would head for one of the slave districts and hope he spotted one of the subtle signs of a path to freedom. That plan changed when a man with a blue lightsaber tried to stealthily cut through the chains and remove the children from the end of the line. Ree stopped and turned to watch. He had no idea what the man, Jedi, thought he could stealthily use a lightsaber for anything. Those things were loud and bright. The man froze at Ree's attention. He had a square mustache and beard over tanned skin. Blast, you're wearing Beskar, aren't you? Damn hard to influence through this stuff. You could just use the key. Ree held it out. I was going to help them escape anyway. The children who understood standards started chattering at that. Quiet, little ones, said the man. I have clothes and a scanner nearby in case you have any chips, but will need to be quiet for a short while. He freed the rest of them from their chains, then hefted the youngest up in his arms. Ree went for the next youngest, who looked only a year older, though they were a species he didn't recognize, so who knew how old the ad was. They had the others hold hands, with the eldest bringing up the rear. Every march, said the man in a quiet shout. He then turned to Ree. Jedi Master Nico Diaz of Clan Diaz. Pleasure to meet you. A clan? Ree, Clan Eldor. Ree returned. May as well throw his clan in there, if the Jedi had one as well. I'd heard Mandalorians like children, but I'd get to see any evidence of it. Good to be proven wrong, Ree. Ree suspected it was more that before the Mandalorians' dilemma, none had been interested in working with a Jedi. A fair number of every generation of Mandalorians were former slaves, after all. With Ree and Diath carrying the two slowest, their pace was fast. Diath led them through a series of alleyways and into what looked like an abandoned building. They walked away from dim emergency lights and down a hidden staircase that Diath must have opened with the Force. Inside was an Ithorian doctor with a droid assistant. The genial doctor made some jokes and demonstrated the scanner on Diath first before asking the eldest of the Ade to submit to a scan. Only one, a Pantoran, had a chip, so that was quickly removed, while Diath kept the other children entertained. Ree took the opportunity to remove and stow his armor in a bag he carried for just such a purpose. He didn't know if it was being raised new Mandalorian at first or just practicality, but he didn't mind removing his armor in front of strangers, unlike some of his peers. In any case, Blussug the Hutt had no idea what he looked like or where his ship was berthed. With his armor off and stowed, Ree was effectively anonymous. "Did Blussug look to be taking on any other slaves that needed freeing?" asked Diath once Ree had come over to join the children. "He only trades in slaves at all, as far as I'm aware." Diath grinned brightly. His mustache was rather distracting. It kept drawing Ree's attention to his lips. "That's because I've been hitting all his shipments of slaves and freeing them." Ree had the suspicion that if he'd still been working for the Hutt, he'd have just found the source of the Hutt's unexplained losses over the past months. "You've probably scared him off for a while," he said. "Good, good," Diath said, nodding. The doctor was finishing up, putting a bacta patch on the Pantoran kid's wound. They spent the next few hours smuggling the children in groups of 2s or 3s to various underground paths which would get them off-planet and either back home or to new homes. Ree wished them all well and tapped down on his own urge to rescue a few himself. Much like Tukas, it was hard to adopt just one ad, and Ree was barely keeping himself afloat, much less Ade. He and Diath ended up in a grimy cantina afterwards. Diath was curious why Ree was working for a Hutt, whereas Ree was curious if all Diath did was wander around freeing slaves or if Jedi arranged regular missions to free slaves. Turns out it was both. Diath did just spend all his time freeing slaves from the Hutts, and Jedi did like to run missions freeing slaves whenever possible. "Would you need some help?" asked Ree. "I still need to make enough money to get my ship running, but I prefer anything over working for the Hutts." My Hutt bounty is getting quite high. It might be time to change up my methods, so as to confuse the bounty hunters. And who would look for me with a Mandalorian? No one! Ah! Ree wasn't going to mention that with the publication of the Mandalorians' Dilemma, that scenario became more likely every day. He also knew several other Mandalorians who hung around Hutt space and would be happy to spend their time freeing slaves over working for the Hutts, or as mercenaries and bounty hunters. He looked over at Diath once more. That mustache really was intriguing, even if he didn't usually go for males. There was also an entire clan Diath of Jedi and Force sensitives to choose from as potential partners. Spending his time freeing slaves, getting to see a Jedi in action, and possibly finding a Jedi renew himself? This could be the start of a great partnership.